Funding for this film made possible in part by IPAC Marine Environmental Research Corporation, a 501c3 that supports youth-centered programs like the Freya Restoration Project, Middle Peninsula Sea Scouts, Tidewater Wooden Boat Workshop, and Florio Aquaponics.
B&C Seafood, Newport News, Virginia, is a proud sponsor of this film, operating a fleet of 9 vessels harvesting in a sustainable North Atlantic sea scallop fishery, also offering shrimp, Canadian snow crab clusters, lobster tails, and fish for customers since 2001.
The Matthews Maritime Foundation and Museum is a proud supporter of this film. We are dedicated to preserving, protecting, and displaying examples of the rich maritime heritage of Matthews County. Visit us on Gwynns Island, Virginia.
Production funding for the legacy of Gilbert Klingel, Man of Steel, has been made possible by Davenport & Company, LLC. Davenport & Company, building wealth and earning trust for individual investors and institutions for 155 years.
We've done every type of tack known to man so far, and she's handled everything we've done beautifully. So it's been a pleasure to sail her. She's almost got a mind of her own sometimes, and it's a good thing. Maybe that's part of what Gilbert Klingel built into her, was a bit of him. And because he's the one that laid out the hulls, decided the shape and where to put the curves. So it's a fine little craft. We've been out in seas that the modern boats, they still at the dock usually. So she's a good boat.
Gilbert Klingel was a self-taught naturalist. He was a boat builder, an adventurer, an explorer, author, and underwater diver. Perhaps Klingel's greatest legacy is what a man can do with drive, perseverance, and purpose.
In the first chapter of his book, he describes a nighttime dive. He describes his equipment, but it doesn't matter. His observations are timeless, so that it was done before most people were born around this country. Again, timeless. What he described is going on right as we speak under the Chesapeake Bay, just a little ways in that direction. Time simply doesn't matter. He was a great environmentalist and had a great ability to describe things that anyone could understand, from a little kid to a senior citizen.
I have entered another world, for I am swinging from the end of a long rope 20 feet beneath the surface of the Chesapeake Bay, about 3 miles out from shore. I peered into a great void. As I watched, something ghostly flitted across the glass of my bronze helmet, burst into livid green flame, and then, as abruptly, disappeared.
Gilbert was born in 1908, more than a century ago. His grandfather came over from Germany and was a pharmacist and a businessman. He established a pharmaceutical company that was headquartered in downtown Baltimore. Gilbert's father accepted the family business and assumed Gilbert would also follow in his footsteps. But it was not Baltimore or the family's wealth or businesses that became Klingel's passion.
He was quite a fellow. I got to meet his widow one afternoon in 1988, and the shop was just the way he'd left it. She still wouldn't let anybody touch anything, the overhead hoists and all. And I forgot about it for 30 years and then found myself here. Feel hugely privileged.
When he was still a young boy of 8 years old, his family took him on vacation to Virginia, to a remote place on the Chesapeake Bay called Gwynns Island. His family stayed at Hudgens House, a 19th century waterfront farmhouse that took in paying guests during the days of steamboat travel. It was there that Gil found his destiny.
Gilbert Klingel was my dad. Hudgens House was a kind of boarding house where people came in the summer especially for a week or maybe 2 weeks for vacation. Well, from Baltimore, my dad's family came down on the old steamers, and it was most likely the Pianka Tank, the name of the steamer. That was in the time frame 1914, 15, up maybe 1917, in that time. We found, when we talked to one of the owners of Hudgens House, an old book that had guests sign in. And there was a signature of my dad showing 1917, that my father was there and his sister, and that's where they spent that summer, at least. We know that for sure. It was there that he saw the schooners come in to the Piankatank. At that time it was much deeper. It's all silted in that area now. But he was extremely impressed by that, and he must have thought in his head, one day I'm going to build one of those. And it turned out he actually did.
I was raised, you can probably see it in the camera, right over here in this home, which is not far from where we're standing, where Gilbert Klingel built boats. And it was pretty easy. My childhood on Gwynn's Island, of course, was a different time back then. But on Gwynn's Island, it was a very close-knit community. Everyone knew everyone, and everybody knew whose kids belonged to who. So I used to roam about the neighborhood quite a bit, and I'm liable to end up anywhere. But one of the things that my grandmother would always say, when I'd been over and helped Gilbert Klingel, I would come home with steel dust and dirt all over my jeans, and she didn't have to ask me where I'd been. She'd look at me and she'd say, well, you've been in the shop with Mr. Klingel today, haven't you?
He saw marine life abounding everywhere, and his intense curiosity drove him even then to explore, observe, and learn. Gil not only found his love of the bay, but he found his desire to photograph and describe, share and preserve this abundance for the world. When he returned to Baltimore, he continued to study everything he saw in nature. This interest led him to join the Maryland Academy of Sciences at the age of 10. There he met Wally Coleman, another young, aspiring naturalist of the same age, and Doc Flodung, who soon became his mentor. It was Doc Flodung who most influenced Gilbert's life and his outlook about nature and the world.
As you know, he was a naturalist, and this is just a simple story that I liked. But he would go down around the shoreline in the marsh grass and catch snails, like periwinkles, and he would paint them different colors and put them back and watch them migrate so he could tell where they were living and how far they traveled and that type of thing.
In his late teens, Klingel visited the American Museum of Natural History in New York and was amazed by the large, strange lizards he saw on display. He then pursued the opportunity to head to the Haitian Islands on a tramp steamer and film the largest known lizard, the rhinoceros iguana, for the Museum of Natural History. Gil filmed perhaps the first ever footage of these monsters with his early model 35mm cinema camera. He arrived in Haiti in 1928 and set up camp amidst thousands of island birds. Klingel then set out to do what he came for, and without the benefit of a zoom lens, he set out bait and observed the giant creatures that could only be found in this remote area of the planet. This experience only served to whet his appetite, and Gil almost immediately after returning began planning, funding, and building a research vessel to return to the Caribbean. It was around this same time in 1929 that Doc Flodung left the Academy of Sciences and founded the Natural History Society of Maryland. Gilbert and Wally followed him there and became founders and curators of the society. Both the Natural History Society and the American Museum of Natural History supported and assisted Klingel in preparing for a research voyage to the Caribbean, which was to be unlike any other so far. Klingel supervised the construction of his 37-foot research vessel and named her the Basilisk, after a lizard that could run across the water. She was designed after the Spray, the boat used by Joshua Slocum, the first man to sail around the world solo in 1898.
Gilbert had a curiosity to know how everything worked, especially in nature. And he did this not by just reading books. He did read a lot of books, but he would go out and observe in person so he could just watch with patience how every little thing in nature was connected, and how each individual thing or animal or creature, how it behaved. And of course, he looked at this holistically.
Gil enlisted his lifelong friend Wally Coleman to go with him on this new adventure. What transpired was so unexpected and so monumental that it later led to Gil's first book, Inagua. The men left Baltimore in 1930 with their boat half filled with research instruments and half filled with provisions for the trip, and planned to explore the islands in search of rare specimens of plant and animal life. But Mother Nature and the storm of 1930 sent them on a different course, one they were lucky to have survived.
And all of a sudden the storm came up. And it was one of those storms that came out of the Atlantic, and all of a sudden, before you knew it, they were getting the sails down, running around like crazy. It lasted for 10 days.
Inagua was just the first test of Gilbert's mettle, and his ability to turn a devastating and dangerous experience into a scientific breakthrough was recognized as a feat of sheer willpower. After surviving the horrible storm in the Atlantic for 10 days, and while both men were passed out from sheer exhaustion, the Basilisk, Gil and Wally's vessel, struck a coral reef and began to sink.
Well, first off, Inagua is the most southern island in the Bahamas, and it's one of the most remote and the least visited by tourists. And I, at first, thought that Inagua did not have very many nice beaches.
Okay, I'll take it around.
And
Krista.
then one day I went onto Google Earth and I noticed that along the far northeast shore, which is completely opposite of the side that Matthewtown is on, I noticed that there was this really long beach that was, probably 10 or 15 miles long, and it just looked so beautiful on Google Earth. No mention in any guidebook, no talk about it anywhere.
The only thing they could do was to get the equipment, the cameras, any food, all the important things off. They were in a lagoon on the northeast point of Inagua. So they spent hours getting everything off that they could possibly get off. Set up tent at the area where they had landed. And then what to do.
Gil left Wally to salvage their equipment and set out to find out where they had been stranded.
Gilbert went some distance and he came upon a little boy, a native boy, and asked in English, of course, "Where are we? What is this island?" The little boy was so afraid. He thought my father was crazy, but he's told him, "This is the island of Inagua."
To his surprise, there was one village on the island, and its governor, a Mr. Richardson, wanted to fine them for illegally landing and planned to confiscate their boat and gear. Gil appeared before the local magistrate and produced a letter giving him scientific permissions, but it wasn't until Mr. Richardson dropped dead of a heart attack that they were allowed to leave the village and pursue their activities.
I mean, it's otherworldly, to put it mildly. You feel like you're on another planet, and just the fact that you're smack dab in the middle between Miami and San Juan, Puerto Rico, yet you're in a place where not only most Americans have never heard of, most people in the Bahamas are even unfamiliar with it.
Wally headed home to his fiancée, and Gilbert took up residence in a small hut to study the island and write about his discoveries.
His really interest in science and nature was what drove him to continue to stay on the island and to observe. And he wanted to make the best of it, despite everything. He was actually like a Robinson Crusoe person. He was used to surviving in the wilderness. He had done a lot of exploring before this, knew how to survive with very, very little. He knew how to find food if he had to.
I had posted on TripAdvisor the idea to do this trek, and in mentioning that there were no guidebooks about it, no photos of it, anywhere on the internet. And that's the one thing I really was enamored by, is until I visited, there was literally no video, no photos, or any travel logs of anyone having gone to the northeast shore of Inagua. So I literally was in uncharted territory.
Might be more of a challenge than I thought.
The only account online that I was able to find of anybody having been to the northeast shore was from Gilbert Klingel himself in 1930. That was literally the only info that I was able to find about the east shore of Inagua anywhere online was from Gilbert Klingel. So that made it all the more sweet of an objective to get there, just to put it on the world stage, you know.
Probably most people when shipwrecked would have given up and gone home. But he decided to make the best of it and stay and find out what was on this island. But Gilbert decided to stay in this little hut, with his only friend being a spider in the corner of the wall. And of course he wanted to explore the entire island while he was there. So that is what he did. He explored on land and water. He even did some undersea diving with very little equipment. It was all for science and for his curiosity that he had to do this. He was not afraid of anything.
I had to be careful. A monstrous green moray measuring 6 feet or more swam leisurely under my thrashing toes when I passed too close to its hole in the cliff. The beast gave me one of the nastiest scares I've ever had.
His determination is just amazing. He made one trek on Inagua that was probably 50 miles, and he took off with like 3 quarts of water and 4 cans of Spam. And I don't think I'd make it around the block, but he did it. He had the determination and the willpower to accomplish what he needed to do, and that's a hallmark for all of us, that yes, we can do the things we need to if we just apply and just go for it.
I marveled at the predicament in which I found myself, that I should subject myself to mosquito bites, hot sun, dirty water, and a few ounces of corned beef daily for food. I was half 100 miles from base with no shoes, no food, and a quart of chocolate-covered water.
Gil finally returned to Baltimore and immediately started writing for scientific journals and for the Baltimore Sun. At first he wrote about his discoveries in Inagua. By the mid-1930s, he wrote mostly about his obsession, the Chesapeake Bay, and the almost endless variety of marine life and the way these creatures carried out their own bizarre actions. He was prolific, and his columns were well received. Life was good. He long ago had left the family pharmacy business, but by then Gil had married the company's secretary, Emma. Gil amassed such a large collection of these feature articles that he decided to publish them in the form of a book called simply The Bay.
It had seemed like a simple thing in the early hours of that May evening to step into a small boat and sail out on the Chesapeake Bay, to anchor, don a diving suit, and drop beneath the waters. But now that the surface was 20 feet above my head, and there lay 30 feet of black bay below, I found that I was beginning to feel a little overawed, and this feeling was enhanced by the knowledge that, although many thousands of people in steamers and pleasure yachts had sailed over this very spot, I was the first human being ever to penetrate intimately this particular portion of the Earth's surface.
And I'll first start with his book called The Bay. The first chapter, and I encourage all of you to read this, he was a great describer of Mother Nature. The first chapter in that book is a nighttime dive, or a series of them, that he took in the bay over half a century before I was doing this stuff. And it felt, that's why I feel the association with it, because I dived at night in the same spots that he did, and I saw essentially the same things. So it was like we were dive buddies, only separated by half a century.
Much of this underwater research was acquired through the use of the Mentharium, the bay's first diving bell, launched in 1935 by Klingel and his diving team from the Natural History Society and the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory of Solomon's Island, Maryland. Gill's work wasn't always conducted under strict scientific guidelines. He would often, under impulse, swim far out from shore and enjoy the solitude and natural forces of the bay. One time, however, off Smith Point, Virginia, Gill got more than he bargained for.
With lashing hands, I drove away the creatures, rose to the surface, and with face aflame opened my eyes. My chest, limbs, stomach, back, arms, and face burned frightfully. Because of the pain, I forgot to swim, began gulping water, and felt myself going down.
The Bay, Klingel's groundbreaking work on Chesapeake Bay marine life, was stunning, and it won the John Burroughs Medal of the American Museum of Natural History. It not only showed his knowledge of the bay creatures, it showed his endless energy and drive in learning about them. Gill would sit for hours, sometimes days, in one spot to discover and investigate what made these creatures tick. What was their life cycle? And what was its effect on their world? He also studied the cycles of the bay in such a way as to give us a snapshot of the bay in his time. A picture similar to today's view of the bay, yet in some ways drastically different.
I first became acquainted with him as a 15-year-old high school student, which I petitioned my English teacher to let me do a book report on a National Geographic article. Well, she said no. I came back and said, well, it's so great. So finally, I was a C student, by the way, in English. She let me do it. And it was the best one of our whole class. I got an A+ on it. But it was the National Geographic article. But when I came here, people asked me if I knew Gilbert Klingel. I said, I don't think so. He was a local diver, and there are local divers everywhere. Finally, someone, Marcy, showed me this article. I said, of course I know him. Of course. I knew every picture in that article. I could almost quote the article verbatim. And there's especially one picture in there that Klingel took of a toadfish. And 50 years or more later, I did it with motion pictures. And I swear you'd think it's the same bloody toadfish. Because the only difference between Gilbert Klingel's picture and mine was that you could see the toadfish breathing. His was a still shot, over 50 years old. In mine, you could see him breathing. They're essentially the same.
We were entering a zone of highly phosphorescent water, and the line that we first thought was breakers on a beach or a shoal was really the outer limits of this region. The hull became visible with a greenish sheen, much like the glow that comes off the hands and a dial of a luminescent watch. Every square inch of water was glowing, every ripple and bubble was sharply delineated, etched in phosphorescence. For eerie effect, I have never seen anything quite like it.
During World War II, Klingel took a job with Armco Steel Company in the metallurgy department. He learned quickly and soon rose to become director of metallurgy. He learned what formulas of steel worked best in marine applications, and after the war, he began using this knowledge to build his submersible, the Aquascope. National Geographic sent a team of journalists, photographers, and scientists to work with Gill at Gwen's Island in 1953. The resulting article in the May 1955 issue was astounding. Never before had color photographs and film been taken of the depths of the Chesapeake Bay, showing its diversity and beauty right here on America's eastern seaboard.
Everything's fine. We've got a beautiful gorgonian in front of us here, about 3 feet tall, and every one of the individual animals on it is out in full bloom. The thing looks like some sort of a fantastic feather. Beautiful thing. Looks like an ostrich feather, sort of.
It was the bay Captain John Smith first explored after landing in the New World in 1607. Morgan Wells followed Gill's footsteps and later gave Klingel credit as his mentor. Wells, who earned his Ph.D. at the University of California and proclaimed to have spent more time underwater than any man on planet Earth, admired Klingel immensely.
Very innovative, especially my life has been involved in life support systems and submarine technology and so forth. I think he was a man ahead of his time. When you look at the things, well, he was a steel boat builder, but he also built these steel underwater chambers, and he did it without a whole lot of knowledge about what had gone before him, because not that much had gone before him. So he had to be very innovative and a free thinker. For example, how to get all this gas down, this air down to the people inside of his underwater chamber. Now, what ventilation rates did he need to do? And what about the structural integrity? Some of the stuff he did was kind of dangerous, you know. But he could probably never do it today because there'd be so many bloody regulations about how to build this thing. I don't think he had a single regulation. He only worried about what he knew would work and not kill somebody. Okay. Remember, he put his 13-year-old daughter in this thing and sent her down. So I guess he was pretty confident in the work. I don't think I'd put my 13-year-old daughter in anything that I wasn't quite confident.
I myself had the opportunity, I was a young kid then, and I had the chance of going down in the aquascope with another person. I was not afraid at all because I knew that my dad had built it and it was no danger. And you go through the hatch and they clamp the hatch down, and there's a chain, above water there was a barge, and the aquascope would go down the middle, and there was a chain. They would crank the chain little by little, slowly taking you down to the bottom. Usually maybe 20 feet, 30 feet. It didn't have to be deep to see all these sea creatures. And when you got to the bottom, you would just sit there slowly so all the murk would just sort of settle so you could see. And I was amazed that you could actually see once it was calm. And when I was down there, I saw right in front of my eyes 2 eels get in a fight right in front of the glass window. That was so exciting. And the fish that went by, and it was absolutely beautiful, so calm. It's another world entirely. I can understand why my father was so excited and interested in knowing what was down there.
They were not out in full flower, so to speak. All we saw then was just the purple stalks. Today, all the purple stalks are fringed with the little individual polyps, which is an interesting observation. Apparently, gorgonians must go to sleep at night.
It was amazing to see this. This was the greatest thing that always intrigued me. He had a submarine, but it wasn't really a sub, but it was between 2 pontoons with a framework, and he would take this to locations in the bay and lower himself down on the bottom and watch the activity. And one of the places that I know that he did that in Milford Haven was down here by the Red Buoy. And because he'd tell me there was a hole down there and people used to catch a lot of fish there, and he'd go there and take that submarine and drop it down on the bottom and observe what he could see and document all that stuff. So, you know, from all his sailboat travels and travels through the Bahamas to being a guy that I think he went a lot of places in Chesapeake Bay and really observed bottom activity and saw the change of the seasons and things in the bay.
I mean, imagine not even just thinking about it. Well, it's one thing to think about it, but he built that whole diving apparatus from scratch. He not only conceived of it, he built it, and then he got it out there, and then he went down, and it wasn't plush. But what he got to see was things that, and if he hadn't, we wouldn't even have that awareness, these highways of life in the water. I used to hunt with my father, and he'd lay in fence rows. He didn't want to shoot. He was in love with the planet. He was passionately in love with the planet. And I'm convinced that Gil Klingel had the same kind of passion and respect, reverence.
The concept of life as an intricate web puts a new aspect on our biological approach. There's no such thing as isolation. Nature is a vast system of interlinking and ramifying coordinations. If one thread is pulled, 100 are shaken or loosened. The vibration is transmitted to the whole.
But the innovation, the simple thing of how to build it, but then how to transport it, get it there, put it on the bottom when you're fighting currents and all this sort of thing. Smart guy.
Gil's life and work continued in this new direction with his love of boats and their design and construction. He was instrumental in building the Basilisk for the ill-fated 1930 expedition. Now he had the resources and the know-how to begin building boats of his own. Boats with hulls not made of wood or fiberglass, but of steel. Boats that could withstand the impact and abuse that would destroy these other materials.
He was passionate about boats and had this experience in Inagua, and I think that he really believed his experience with steel, that he was keeping the thing going and saving lives, and people could enjoy the positive aspects of his experience with boats without having to suffer the calamitous effects of putting a wood boat on a sandbar. Steel is an entirely different material. So it's a far-reaching, I would say, not just progressive, but progressing the tradition. Tradition without innovation is dead. He's very forward-looking. That had to be a lonely place to be. You can't do that. Nobody's done that. And he persevered regardless. I think he had a common love for the planet, the culture, and the Chesapeake. And this provided him an opportunity to integrate all of those things.
As a metallurgist, he learned the perfect combination to build steel boats. And he utilized that. You know, he made his first boat up in Maryland before he came down here to Gwen's Island. And so he learned how to move that steel, cut that steel, bend that steel, whatever needed to be done on a boat. And he taught himself. Then he wrote a book about it, which has influenced many people, even through Europe. After the war, you know, wood was kind of a scarce thing, you know, and there was plenty of steel around. So a lot of Europeans started building steel boats. So he was really influential to a lot of people in such a quiet way.
He first built these vessels at his home in Baltimore. Then he began searching his beloved Gwen's Island until he found the perfect location for a boatyard and a railway system on Milford Haven, on a spit of land sandwiched between the Piankatank River and the Haven, with a direct course by water leading out onto the Chesapeake. Gil's family life also took a turn. Emma did not enjoy the water as Gil did. This drove the couple apart. By the time Gil moved to Gwen's Island, he had a new love interest, Virginia Ivy, a graduate of the University of Richmond Law School and a clerk for a Virginia Supreme Court justice. She shared Gil's love of the Chesapeake, and they moved to their new home together.
Gwen's Island was the place that Gilbert always wanted to come back to. And he did manage to live his dream. He did just that. And when the opportunity came up, he grabbed it and he took it and he was here. And he bought the land, early 50s, and the first thing he did was to build the railway and the little winch house so he could start building boats and have a place to put his boat. And this really was the fulfillment of his dream, to be on the Chesapeake Bay, on Gwen's Island, his favorite place in the world, and with his wife of his dreams too. Virginia Ivy. And this is where he began a new career, a hard career, physical career in building boats. Building boats from 30-footers up to a 75-footer, all by himself.
I can remember helping him from a very young age, probably being a nuisance at 5 or 6 years old, as soon as my grandmother would let me venture out in the neighborhood, and probably right on up through high school when I did other things. And he was really active at that particular time. He was very active building boats, and he was, I can never forget working with him. He always wore khakis, a lot of times khaki colored pants and shirt, and he was a pretty tall guy for me being a young kid, and we used to look up at him like, wow, you know, he was just amazing to watch what he could do. But he was a very organized individual, and I think some of that rubbed off on me. He had a place for everything. He was very precise in the plan of what he'd want to accomplish in the build of the boat that day or that week. So he always had a very precise, organized plan, and he was an absolute master builder. He could fabricate anything, and it didn't make any difference what it was, whether it was actually the boat hull or fabricating parts for the boat, the interior pieces, or the water plumbing, or the engine mounts, or the machinery. There wasn't anything that he couldn't do.
Well, when you get up in the morning to do something like that, to build a boat, if you've got a crew, it's one thing, but it takes what a friend of mine, one of my heroes in the trade, says, a lot of stick-'em to take on a project like that, and to get up day after day after day after day and persevere.
I guess he built about one boat a year, and I asked him, you know, about building more boats or something, and he said, well, you know, a lot of people bring me plans and ask me to build their boat. And he says, I look at them, and if I think it's going to be a pretty boat, I might talk to them. But if I think it's not going to be a pretty boat, I tell them I just don't have the time to work it in.
So what amazed me is how talented he was. And I used to love to watch him get the sheets of steel out and take the blueprints and loft those plans and lay that out in steel and make those cuts. Because it was just, he had an exact pattern. He would lay the keel out, and usually, a lot of times, he'd actually start at the stern and work toward the bow, putting these frames in, and he'd put all the frames in, and then he would start putting plate in. And I always loved to see him cut that plate, and I'd ask him, well, you measured here and you measured here, how do you know your curve? And he'd tell me, it's all in the book, son. And so he would cut perfect curves in the steel, and it would be a section that goes on the hull, and he would tack weld the end of it, and he would know exactly where to put a pad eye inside. And he never really wanted me to weld or grind. I think he was too particular, and he was going to, you know, a kid would definitely mess his project up.
Klingel built a very seaworthy boat, and I'm sure he knew exactly what he was up to. The hull design and it was an Al Mason design.
Few objects in this mechanized modern world instill in their owners as much concern and love as their boats. I'm referring to those men who love boats for their own sake, who find in their vessels an expression of their personalities, who want a boat which is a thing alive, strong, and seaworthy, and also an object of beauty unlike any other creation of man.
He would put a pad eye inside that plate. He would tack it exactly where he wanted it, usually on a frame, and we'd use huge shackles usually and go across inside the hull on a frame, sometimes a little bit of an angle, and he'd know exactly, and he'd say, put that shackle right there. Sometimes he'd even put a chalk X on the frame where he wanted me to pull from, and I'd get inside the boat with the chain come along, and basically our chain fall, and we'd pull that plate in, and if it fit perfect, he would tack it some more and we'd keep pulling. If it didn't fit, or he didn't like something about it, it all came apart. He'd get the grinder out, and he'd say, stop. And we'd turn it loose, and he wouldn't say a word to me, and he'd start cutting tack wheels right back off, and he'd say, I need to make an adjustment.
One of Gil's first successes was a 30-foot sailboat called the Freya. Freya meaning the goddess of love and beauty. She survived the years and was donated to the Matthews Maritime Foundation. The Freya was much in need of restoration, and the work began in earnest in the summer of 2016.
I started working with my brother down in Florida. We checked the boat out. We started, she'd been sitting for 9 years with no activity, and so she needed some work. And the mast was the biggest thing that needed to be done. And so my brother, scarfed new wood into it. I went down and then painted it. We re-rigged the boat this last trip down. This is a project that's been going on for a year now. When we left St. Augustine, we weren't able to get the mast in, and that was a big problem. To carry a mast on board, we took it down, put it on the boat so we could find somebody else to put it in, so we started up the intercoastal waterway and got as far as Ferrandina in Florida. And here it was again, another serendipitous moment where we're looking around, we can't find anybody to put the mast in. We passed a barge that had a crane on it, and we just went over and said, hey, could you put the mast in for us? And they looked kind of skeptical at first, but then they came back and they said, okay, we'll do it. And so, one of the fellows, there were two of them, and one of them said, well, what's it worth to you? And I said, a lot. We need this mast in so we can get this boat sailing. She wants to sail. So, found out later it was the first time they ever put a mast in. They did a good job, the crew, everybody worked together, and we got the rigging tied into the boat, and things were looking good. So I went up on deck with some money and went to the crane operator, and I said, he looked at me and he said, no, we won't take any money. This was, and it was like, wow, you could have knocked me over the feather, but it was one of those moments that, yeah, this was meant to be as well.
Bring her around, Rob. Hoist the mainsail. Okay.
Is that foul?
It's clear. Clear.
The next day, we bed all the sails on, tried her out in the sound, and she looked good. So we headed right out into the Atlantic and took off. She proved her mettle the first afternoon and evening. Matter of fact, that was one of the moments that you really felt like Gilbert was kind of watching over things, because right at sunset, I was looking out and I was taking a picture of sunset, and all of a sudden there were dolphins all around the boat. For like 20 minutes, they just hung around, dancing on the surf of the boat and, diving under. And it was almost like, well, they're welcoming Freya back to the sea. They came out to greet her, like they could hear the sound of her going through the water.
Also, we had to redo the tiller a few times. We had one replacement one, and that was not adequate, so we made another one and added bolts to the head of the rudder to strengthen it. And I'm glad we did, because we were putting a lot of stress on it at times.
I got a board here, so I want to have my own sailboat eventually, and I thought this would be the perfect way to learn and pick up a few things, and it's definitely been a learning experience, and I'm definitely going to get a boat. It hasn't changed my mind on it one bit. Hopefully I can sail to Scotland, and down to the dry Tortugas, and I just want to live aboard a boat the rest of my life.
We'd cut down. We were using the small jib and a reef main, one reef in the main, and still that was about an 18 knot breeze we had off of Cape Fear, and she just that hull just said, "Give it to me," you know. And the mast, everything looked good, and you just in that situation, you set your sails and you hang on, you know. So it was really good to see that she could handle that. That's the extreme for this boat. Its boat speed is probably about 5 knots. You know, that should be the normal boat speed. So to almost double it is just an incredible amount of work for the boat to do, and it handled it very nicely. So it's the fact that he could take a design and absorb it into his mind and then go cut steel that's going to make a boat is pretty phenomenal. So when she goes through the water at 9 knots, you can thank Gilbert for building a very, very fine hull.
Wind gusts 34 knots or greater and small hail. Source, radar indicated. Impact, small craft could be damaged in briefly higher winds and suddenly higher waves. Locations impacted include Highway 94 Bridge, Albemarle Sound, the mouth of the Brick Women's River, the center of the Albemarle Sound at Edenton. Move to safe harbor until hazardous weather passes.
Last night we spent the night on Goose Creek on Pamlico River. We got hit by a pretty severe thunderstorm. Winds probably got up to 55, and just blew the water flat, and a nice rain shower. We couldn't see 100 feet.
Well, we had the alternator rebuilt before we left, and when they did, they for some reason replaced the pulley with a brand new one, and the back spacing is incorrect. So what it's doing is just eating belts, unfortunately.
There was nobody to say, here, this is how you're going to cut this plate, and this is how you're going to cut that plate. He decided what he was going to do, and it was a total success. That boat, she almost makes her own wind. You know, when you get the sails up, she keeps creeping up into the wind because she's changing the wind direction as she speeds up. And that's very impressive for any boat, but that, again, that was Gilbert Klingel's genius. That's what, that's where he could cut things and put them together, and they worked. The entire trip was a tribute. You know, it was almost like the Freya was celebrating Gilbert by showing that she could do what he designed her to do. And so she was celebrating Gilbert as we were celebrating Gilbert. She's just beautiful to sail. You have your hand on the helm, she'll fight you. She wants to come up into the wind, and you just have to keep pulling her back and say, no, we're not going up there, we're gonna go here. And so, well, she was a lot of fun. We sailed all kinds of different tacks, and she just loved them all.
I'm gonna bring her down to neutral.
He built, I don't know how many boats, but in the springtime, I would look out there, and it might be a half a dozen steel boats anchored out there. Boats that he had built, and people were making the migration from south to north, and they always stopped and just to pay their respects to Gil.
I think it'll be fantastic to have one of the boats that he built back here in the county particularly here on Gwynn's Island, right here at the site where it was built. I think it's great. A lot of people really didn't know what kind of quality boat he built. He would build them, somebody would buy them, and they would always leave Matthews. So unless you were here when he launched it and rigged it, and when the people left, the story was over, so to speak. And then those stories got lost in time.
Welcome, Freya and crew and all those that have come to celebrate this historical event. On behalf of Matthews Maritime Foundation, I would like to thank the individuals that took the endeavor to obtain, refurbish, and sell Freya to her place of origin. And the work has been impeccable and was greatly appreciated by all of us. Matthews Maritime Foundation will take extreme care of the Freya and work to restore her to her original condition. We will not only display her, but we'll utilize her as a educational tool. And I'm sure that Gilbert Klingel is looking down on this day and is smiling.
The first time that the rescue squad came, we had to put him in a litter and take him off the roof at the front of that building. And then later, I don't remember how much later, but I remember the room and the stairs were there. The first time they were not there. But then we had to bring him down the stairs in the litter. I think we borrowed one from the Coast Guard to take him to the hospital in.
Klingel's life is a shining example of what a man can accomplish with desire, perseverance, hard work, and focus. Gil did many things, and he took a path less traveled. He lived his dreams and shared them. His legacy is one that should be remembered and used as a lesson for today and for our future hopes and dreams.
You don't get that kind of love for the planet without, I don't know of any other relationship that comes even close. The romance, the wooing, the ongoing discovery, and the kind of commitment. Just that one picture where he's out there, he went out regularly to romance those fledgling ospreys. You know, that's not a casual endeavor. That's a love story, a romance that's just grand and glorious. And he could have laid around and read magazines, but he got up and just to read the bay, the lyrical, and to the kind of thing. When you read the bay, and the part that sticks out in my mind is the 24 hours he spent in that marsh. That was not comfortable. Not at all. And so that's what I think the only picture that comes to mind is that of a groom wooing and being wooed by a bride.
I've been really happy to be part of this project to help get Freya, a part of Gilbert Klingel's life, back here to Gwynn's Island, where all this started a long time ago. I mean, his later years were spent here, and he accomplished incredible things, building boats that 75 feet long by himself practically. It's unheard of. So I'm hoping that the Freya helps reflect on what Gilbert had accomplished in his life, and his legacy to continue on and inspire young people that, hey, if you really wanted to do something, you study it and you can do it. And that's something that's missing today, I think.
I think the importance of Gilbert Klingel's work, regardless what it was, boat building or studying nature or building a diving apparatus. Why was he doing this? What was his goal? I think it was because he wanted to get other people involved and to understand more about nature and the universe. For him, he was not the center of the universe. He was just a part like the rest of us. It was not he wanted people to understand that there's much more out there, that there's so much to be seen and studied, and he wanted people to observe more, understand nature more. Nature is what makes it all work. Nature is what makes this earth what it is, and he was at heart, before anything else, a naturalist.
You have to face life and engage with it proactively, and like going to sea, you don't fight it, or living in a place like this, you have to acknowledge it, respect it, work with it, and it'll, like Inagua, it'll beat any pride you got right out of you. But I would say he's a first order poet, and the best definition of a poet I've ever heard was Elizabeth Gouge, an English author. She said a poet is somebody who goes into another world and brings something of that back into this world for the rest of us. And that's what Gil Klingel did. That which you admire in others is that which resides in your own heart. What you admire in Gil Klingel is a reflection of what resides in your own heart.
I live on Gwynn's Island where Wilson Rowe lives, and I work on old pound net, I guess I always will. I work in the morning, I fish by the tide, I got to do it, son, was his mournful cry. Hey, 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 what do you know? Rough seas, foul weather, I think it's gonna blow.
Funding for this film made possible in part by IPAC Marine Environmental Research Corporation, a 501c3 that supports youth-centered programs like the Freya Restoration Project, Middle Peninsula Sea Scouts, Tidewater Wooden Boat Workshop, and Florio Aquaponics.
B&C Seafood, Newport News, Virginia, is a proud sponsor of this film, operating a fleet of 9 vessels harvesting in a sustainable North Atlantic sea scallop fishery, also offering shrimp, Canadian snow crab clusters, lobster tails, and fish for customers since 2001.
The Matthews Maritime Foundation and Museum is a proud supporter of this film. We are dedicated to preserving, protecting, and displaying examples of the rich maritime heritage of Matthews County. Visit us on Gwynn's Island, Virginia.
Production funding for the legacy of Gilbert Klingel, Man of Steel, has been made possible by Davenport & Company, LLC. Davenport & Company, building wealth and earning trust for individual investors and institutions for 155 years.